Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna talk you through a bit of background to diaries first of all, because I feel like we can't just jump straight into app diaries without seeing a little bit of a journey about other kinds of qualitative diaries and how we got there. But I'll try to do that fairly quickly so we can spend a lot more time then on the app diaries. So we'll talk about the advantages of diaries more broadly and some of the challenges, because that leads us into why we wanted to look at maybe creating some apps to try and overcome some of these challenges. But then we'll see that that has challenges of its own while overcoming some of the other challenges, like everything with methods, right? So we'll go through them, and we'll briefly talk about analysing some qualitative diary data, because we think that's a real issue that there's not that much literature on at the moment. Okay, and you can feel free to ask questions as we go, but we'll try and save quite a bit of time for questions at the end as well. Okay, so really brief background on all diaries, mainly focused qualitative diaries. They're very familiar. So we all know what a diary is. It's like when you say to a participant or a potential participant kind of interview you, they know what to expect. So with diaries, it's the same. If we're saying we keep a diary for us, they know what that is. It's not some kind of weird technical jargon. They're not going to have a clue. So it's something that we're all familiar with and we all use. And we also know that we use diaries in lots of different contexts. So like as a lecturer or a teacher, we're often getting students to keep reflective journals and things like that. So when we think of it, we know about the benefits of journaling or diarying. We know about those benefits. So not only as a research method, but beyond. And what diary studies usually, when we're talking about qualitative diaries, usually incorporates broader methods as well. So there's usually an interview before and an interview at the end, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But basically, they are increasing. When I first started using qualitative diaries, there was pretty much nothing in my field. I had to go a bit to health. I know health do quite a lot of good work with qualitative diaries, but there still wasn't that much. It was mainly quantitative diaries. But they are increasingly used. So every time I go to a conference and talk, it's like a lot more people come up to me and say, oh, I'm using qualitative diaries now in my research, which is good to see. But they are quite a neglected part of the researcher's toolkit when you compare them to other methods and how frequently they are used. And another thing that I want to stress is that when you hear about a qualitative diary, people immediately think of maybe just like writing a diary, which is initially how I used it and I think is valuable. But I think actually, if we think about what is a qualitative diary, it's really quite broad. And actually, it's a whole kind of suite of studies, different methods, different modes. So you can have audio diaries, you can have visual diaries, and there's all kinds of different ways that we can use qualitative diaries, which I think is quite exciting. It's a way that we can capture lots of different kinds of things. Okay, so advantages. When we're talking about some of the advantages of qualitative diaries and why we should use them, I mean, it seems like there's loads. It seems like there's just tons of advantages, to me anyway. I'm slightly biased. So one of the most famous ones that's always suggested first in anything that's written about qualitative diaries, or any diaries, quantitative diaries too, is that it avoids or greatly reduces retrospection. So there's lots of kind of cognitive science research and things now that says when we interview people, what we're actually getting is not, obviously depending on your philosophical positioning, what is truth it comes into question, but we're not seeing necessarily how things are actually experienced on day to day. We're seeing an amalgamation of events. So if you ask somebody how you're feeling about a particular thing, in an interview, it depends, first of all, how they're feeling at that moment. That will help them recall different kinds of things at that time, depending how they're feeling. They're also unlikely to remember all the detail of things. So if you want to focus on something that's like the day-to-day kind of, almost to them seems mundane, you're not going to think about it a lot. They're probably not going to remember all the details around that, so why they decided what to do at that specific time, or exactly all the different feelings and thoughts they were having at specific times. In an interview, you're going to get more of an amalgamation of all of that. In a diary, you're capturing it as it happens, so it reduces retrospection. And obviously, at the same time, that means we're getting more dynamic research. So we can see changes within person over time. So I know more and more journals in our area are saying we need to look at more within-person change. So rather than just comparing between what's happening within one person. So obviously, diaries are a great way to capture that. So you can see, you know, that maybe what I feel one day is not how I feel the next day, obviously. So if I'm thinking about my research, which was on work-family conflict and that kind of area, you know, I might say that my work-family balance is great 1 hour. The next hour I might tell you it's terrible because something's just happened, right? And I've not managed to pick the kids up on time, or because work made me run late. But the next day it might be going really well. So it's lots of the phenomena that we're looking at change all the time. So we want to capture that dynamism, and that's what you can do with diaries. Now you can capture all this and reduce retrospection and capture that dynamism with quantitative diaries, but what you get with qualitative diaries is that rich experience from their perspective, in the same way you do with interviews, but you're getting it in the minute. So if you have a quantitative diary where you're filling in a survey basically over time, you don't get to ask, you know, what the different things were that were going on at that time from their perspective. You're guessing that you'll have one of them that they can tick that will be right. Whereas with qualitative diaries, it's, you know, they're really going to go into all the detail. And then, so I've listed the next few. We're capturing those specifics, which are usually really important for what we're looking at. Often when we interview someone, they think of the sensational things, right, that they can remember. And participants almost, I find, want to please you a little bit. They want to give you something that they think is exciting to tell you. And so even when I start with a diary with someone, they go, oh, I don't really have anything exciting to record every day for you. Like, there's nothing really dramatic happening. And I'm like, no, we don't want that. Well, as researchers, we really want what you think is boring is fascinating to us. You know, what you think is boring and happening every day, you know, just like for me, how you were getting out of the house on time and how you manage that thought process of, like, you know, when do I just, you know, rush the kids versus take the time versus have to make this meeting. These tiny things are hugely important because they influence how we're behaving every day, which has larger implications. So the diaries let you capture those kind of more mundane experiences, according to participants, which would be very hard for them to think about when you're interviewing them. And all of these things enable us to build on these new insights and new connections between phenomena that we wouldn't have been able to see before. And also, I have to mention this one, and I'll also talk a bit more about this later, but increasing participant self-analysis. As I mentioned at the beginning, we often use diaries in other settings. So as a researcher, you're told to keep a reflexive diary, aren't you, usually, if you're doing qualitative research, so that you can be reflexive and learning. Like I said, in teaching, we're often getting students to keep reflexive diaries so they can learn and develop. So if you are getting participants to keep reflexive diaries, which, I mean, even if they're not called reflexive diaries, diaries encourage reflection because you're recording what you're doing over time and you're looking at it, and that's making you think. So this is really beneficial for researchers, I would say, because I don't know if anyone's ever interviewed someone who's not naturally reflexive at all, because it's quite challenging. Well, I have. I mean, I've interviewed lots of people who are great and you can't stop them talking, and they've obviously really analysed themselves quite a bit. But I've also interviewed people who they just, I don't know, just because it is, just the way it is. You know, like, some people don't, you know, naturally in their day-to-day lives need to reflect at all or need to self-analyse. So this is a way to encourage that. Having them do this over time means that when you speak to them after the diary, they've been thinking on a different kind of level, which helps you to get under the surface a little bit more. So these are some of the benefits of qualitative diaries, broadly, but they're not without their challenges. Which is obviously, you know, what we've experienced, what me and Leanne have been discussing, and why we came to think, okay, is there a potential to do an app here? So some of the first challenge is huge. For anyone who has used qualitative diary studies, you will know this so well, that acquiring participants and then maintaining those participants is extremely challenging with this kind of study. So you're asking people to give up such a great deal of time for you. You know, it's not even just a one-off interview for an hour or two. It's, you know, this is over time. It depends obviously how long you're asking them to do it, but this is, you know, they're busy. Usually we're studying busy people. Well, you know, in my research, I'm always studying busy people by the nature of what I'm looking at. So it's hard to do that. And I'm going to come on to the next slide with some suggestions and tips, but there's no perfect solution. And then maintaining that kind of over time when you're not there. So that leads to the next point, ensuring effective completion without the presence of the researcher. I think what I hadn't necessarily thought about when I started out with diaries was that, okay, that I'm not going to be there when they complete the diary. So in an interview situation, they'll tell you something and you'll go, oh, that's why and how, and draw it out. You can't do that with a diary because you're not there. They're on their own. So you have to think about, first of all, how are we going to make sure that we're getting as much depth as possible in those diary entries. Sometimes actually a few lines can be really interesting for all kinds of reasons, but we'd like to encourage as much depth as possible. And also then, what if they forget? What if they, don't lose the diary? It's a pen and paper diary. What if they lose it? What if they don't send it back to you? There's all these kind of concerns. So then there's that links to the returning of the diaries and you being able to analyse it. So even if they are really good and they haven't lost the diary and they have kept the diary, you've then got to get it back. Are we then going to ask them to post the diary or to send the diary somehow, as well as all these things we've asked them to do already? Or are we going to go and meet them just to collect the diary and then take it away again to analyse it and then go back again to... So just these kind of practicalities of how do we get the diary back? And because you want to kind of analyse it as soon as possible, and ideally before you then speak to them about it. You want to have read that diary first. So that's a key issue to think about. And here, I mentioned the reflexivity as a positive thing in the previous slide, which I think we usually see that reflexivity is a positive thing. I've got some quotes, I hope they're not too blurry. These are just participants talking about the diaries and how they made them feel. So it made me think more about what I actually do and analyse my motives. I realised that it causes stress doing something and then going back and checking my emails, so I'm not doing it anymore. So you can see it makes them think, it makes them analyse, and sometimes it makes them change their behaviour. So these can be quite positive things, but we have to be aware of that maybe they don't want to be reflecting and realising and uncovering things that maybe they don't want to. They were going along quite happily until we came along and got them to keep a qualitative diary. So someone said, it makes me feel quite raw in a way. I'm talking to you about some of my failings and frustrations, some of the things that make me feel upset. Do I really want to be reminded of where my failures are so explicitly? Upsetting and enlightening, I suppose. So the reason I include this one is just for us to be aware that while this reflexivity might be great for us, might sometimes be great for them, they need to know what they're getting themselves into, and you need to be prepared for this kind of reflexivity that may uncover quite a lot of emotions. So I know there was a session on emotions in qualitative research. That's very relevant if you're doing this kind of research. And it's just something to make sure that the participants are aware of before that you begin. So maybe in an information sheet, saying that you're likely to, reflect on your experience is likely to maybe make you think a bit more, so that they're aware of what to expect. Talk a bit about it with them. So this leads me to some practical considerations of overcoming some of those challenges, but obviously we can't overcome them all the way. So when you're talking about sampling, because we're very difficult for us to get participants in the first place, then what can we do in terms of sampling? So I would suggest that it's ideal if you know people, first of all, because if you're going to ask them to do this, personal contacts become key. For as a starting point. Snowball sampling is also really useful, because if you found someone to keep these diaries for you and they say, actually it was quite interesting, they can tell their friends that actually it was really interesting and it wasn't that bad and we really learned a lot from it, we enjoyed the experience, then you're more likely to get more people. Obviously you can't know everybody, so what about interviewing as a standard? So maybe it's a study where you interview people, and then you ask them at the end of an interview if you've built a nice rapport with them and they kind of feel comfortable with you now, you can then ask them about the diary as a second stage, because you would usually interview first anyway, which I'm talking about next. So use it as a way in, and then you can keep diary, a subset of those participants can keep diaries. You need some kind of contact with them, I would say, before people are going to agree to do this kind of study. Pre and post interviews are really essential, I would say, to kind of begin to overcome a lot of the challenges on the previous slide. So the pre-interview allows you to, first of all, build rapport and get them on board with the diaries. It allows you to explain the diaries. you really need to be clear on the instructions, which is on the next, which is the next point. So you can go through what you want them to do. Like I said, we won't be there as a researcher with the participant completing the diary. So that means that first contact with them and your verbal and the written instructions that you give them are essential to making sure that you don't lose data. So talking them through the different options, talking them through what you're looking for. You need a really kind of explicit I want you to record this. You need it to be very clear. And then what I think is really useful in initial interviews is to use the critical incident technique or something similar, because what that means is you can get them to think of an example, a previous example, something like you want them to record over in the diary, and then you can talk them through that example. So they can tell you about it, and then you can get them to explore it in more depth in that interview, and then you can say to them at the end, that's what I want in the diary. So that's exactly what I'm looking for, and that kind of depth. So it's a really good way to link the two. And post-interviews are really, really important as well. Again, because even the best participants, you're going to be reading those diaries and think, oh, I really want to know why that happened, or I really want to know what the background was to that, or there's going to be questions. So you want to be able to look at those diaries and then go and speak to them again about the diaries and kind of follow up, and you almost sometimes use some of those events as talking points in the follow-up interview. And then also, because of the reflexivity that I've talked about, I think for our own benefit and for the benefit of the participants, you need to ask them about their experience of the process. So you need to ask them about how they found the experience, how they found keeping the diary, whether they felt it had any impact on their feelings, thoughts, practices in relation to whatever topic you're looking at. This helps you to uncover maybe the emotions around it, maybe some additional data, maybe how they decided what to record and what not to record can be really insightful as well. So this gives you extra data to work with to help you analyse in a way that's more true to the participants and captures everything to analyse that data. So that's important. But also for them, for the participants, it's really important as well, because it's giving them a safe space to kind of almost like a debrief. Like, I kind of unpicked all this feeling you've brought to the surface with these diaries, and you're just going to leave me. So let them, give them the space to just share how they're feeling in kind of a safe, kind of confidential environment, I think is the least we can do after they've kept diaries for us for however long we've asked them to. There's lots and lots of other considerations when you first start out with a qualitative diary. So is it going to be unstructured or semi-structured for a start? So are you going to have a blank piece of paper for them to write on, or or no questions, just talk about broadly your day in relation to, or are you going to have a few open-ended questions? So that's something to think about. So it's more semi-structured. Diary medium, like I said, there's lots of different ways to keep diaries. There is not just pen and paper, obviously. We can audio record, we can email, we can have photo diaries, we can have video diaries. How are you going to decide what's the most appropriate? So obviously, the guidance on this is that it depends hugely on what you're looking at and what you're trying to find out and what would be the most important for what you're trying to find out. I think it also depends on your participants a great deal as well. What are they going to be most comfortable with? So sometimes, because of the kind of group that you're studying, you'll know that maybe it wouldn't be best to use, for example, technology, and it would be best to stick to pen and paper, or vice versa. But what I've found is that even within groups of participants, you find that it's just the individual. It's really dependent on their kind of who they are, their preferences. So for example, I tend to now let people be a bit flexible with how they want to record. So I'll say, record it audio, you can write it down, you can do it electronically, but however you feel comfortable with. But I had a lady who was my most talkative interviewee ever. I think I was with her for 3 hours the first time, and I just couldn't. It was all great stuff. I couldn't stop her talking. It was brilliant. It was the opposite of the non-reflexive participant example. But then when it came to her diaries, and she had chosen to write her diary, and when it came to it, I was getting 1 sentence or 2 sentences. I was like, this can't be right for this lady. And she had said that she didn't maybe want to audio record, but I said, just give it a go. And the audio recorded diaries were brilliant. Like, again, couldn't stop her talking. So you almost have to figure out what fits with your participants. And sometimes, you need to figure out as you go as well, which also links to maintaining contact throughout, because that's just so important. So there was papers written a long time ago, not in my field, that said that the only way to get people to keep doing a diary study for you is to maintain contact. Even financial incentives aren't going to work. Not when you're asking them to do this much. It's more about that rapport you've got with them, that maintaining contact with them throughout. So again, in the initial interview, another important thing to do is to discuss this. How are we going to maintain contact throughout this period? What are you comfortable with? What are they happy? You don't want to be pestering them. Obviously, you don't want to feel like you're nagging them all the time. But what you do want is a way to communicate with them fairly regularly. So it can be via text, via email. You can have phone for a quick chat. What are they comfortable with? And it obviously also depends on the length of the diary study, how often you'll be doing this. Will it be weekly? Will it be fortnightly? Will it be monthly? It depends how long you're keeping that diary for. So obviously, if it's about 4 weeks, you might want to speak to them every week to see how they're getting on. If you're keeping it for a longer period of time, you might make that slightly longer. But what is also important with this is that even though you will say, obviously, to your participants, contact me anytime, and if you've got any questions, if you're completing the diary, think of any questions, contact me, they won't. They will never contact you. So that doesn't mean they don't have questions. It means that they're busy and it's not top of their priority list. So when you contact them, they usually will have questions. So it's a good idea to contact them so that they get to ask their questions. And usually it's really important for you to answer those questions as well. Because, for example, with one of my couples, the man wanted to ask if he could complete his wife's diary for her. And he'd started to do that for a couple of days. I was like, no, I'm looking for 2 different perspectives here. This is really important So by talking about that and why that couldn't happen, that was really good, because otherwise I would have lost one whole perspective. So they wouldn't have contacted me to ask that. They would have just wondered and assumed, because they're busy. So obviously it's important for you to contact them and let them ask you questions. Okay, so obviously all this is helpful to a point. But when we're thinking about the flexibility of wanting to have different mediums available, when we're thinking about wanting to be able to analyse diaries as we get and we want to get the information as quickly as we can, so we can be analysing and asking follow-up questions as quickly as we can, these standard diaries aren't the best. And that will lead us on to talk about what they're multimodal. As you can see here, I'm going to talk you through this, but this leads us on to why we wanted to develop an app, which we'll talk about. But because we wanted to be able to have all these different kind of options in one place for the participant to use as they felt appropriate. So it's more in their hands rather than as we felt appropriate. So I'm going to go through a few of these. These are from different studies, and they're all different kinds of diary. I have no video diary examples, unfortunately, but we've got audio, pen and paper, and photos. So they're actually from different studies, so I hope this doesn't get confusing. So the audio one that I'm going to play is a project that I'm currently doing, which is I'm going to tell you more about later, so I won't go on too much, but it's about the transition to parenthood, following couples over a longer period of time and looking at how their identities, their work and parenting identities emerge and change over time, and how that links to how they make decisions about work and care. Okay, so this is an audio diary.
Friday the 14th of June, yes, I think, 14th, 15th. Yes, I'm just updating on my request to go part-time. Hang on. Oh, excuse me.
It's authentic data.
So yeah, basically it came around from me just having conversations with my old line manager. As I said, I have been sort of feeling more confident about going back to work, and I suppose I felt like that, that I was able to sort of ask that question more, and I sort of have been a bit nervous. I sort of said, I'd like to do 3 days. I understand I might have to do 4. I spoke to one of my colleagues who's actually a very good friend, which I think helps, because I was able to be quite honest with her. but also in me asking for part-time hours, I've actually said that I'll take on sort of anything in terms of role-wise. You know, I don't need to just stick to the role that I left. You know, I said I can be flexible in that way to help them. So that's sort of my stance at the moment. Yeah, I did feel nervous, and I'm still feeling slightly nervous now. I'm going soon next Friday, so I suppose until I have their, you know, feedback on it, I can't, you know, it's hard to sort of say.
Okay, so that was an audio diary. You can hopefully see how if she keeps recording that over the time that she's off and as she goes back to work and her partner's doing the same, that's really interesting data to be capturing. This one is a written diary related to Leanne's research, which she's going to talk more about when we talk about the apps in a few minutes. But this is about how people make sense of negative interactions at work. So you can just see that it's a written diary. And this is an example from my PhD research on couples. So we've got, this is quite interesting. These always make me laugh, these examples. So we've got Sarah who says, hard work getting out of the house this morning. My eldest was taking no notice of anything I asked him to do. Sheer exasperation. Time was running out. I hate shouting at them like that because by that point I've lost the plot and feel really angry. But I did get to work on time. And then she says, and then I had to pick them up. So stressful picking the kids up after work. Both were tired, horribly grumpy, uncooperative. The little one was bawling for the sake of things. I just flipped. They'd just pushed me too far. I picked them up and I'm pleased to see them. And after being at work, neither of them even want to say hello. It makes me feel like not wanting to come home from work, but obviously I have to. I shouted at both of them, drove home like a maniac, didn't want them near me. It felt horrible. I just feel drained and tired now. Sometimes I wonder if it's worth going to work and making life harder for myself. But then I think I escaped to work for my sanity. And he wrote on the same day, no issues today. See, this nice short entry actually is brilliant in this instance, so we don't always need the depth, because that speaks volumes. They weren't all like this. We had couples where it was a lot more, they're both reporting the same kind of incidents, but that tells you a lot and you can compare really well. So that's interesting. You can see she's got work-family conflicts, work-family identity conflicts going on there and all kinds of things. And then we've got some photographs. So I also recently finished a project looking at photographs. So it's what are people's daily experiences of transitions between home and work, or between work and non-work, not necessarily home, work and non-work. So we just got people to take photos for us. And it was like their photo diary of their transitions between work and non-work. And then we interviewed them and got them to talk about their photos as well. And so you have to make a decision with photo diaries about whether you want them to write anything at the time along with the photos or whether you just want to ask them about it later. So you can see that this one is having lunch at work. This actually symbolized work-family conflict for this person because I've not got time to go for lunch. I've got to do it at my desk. And actually what was interesting was that you found that what really similar pictures, some people took really similar pictures of similar kinds of things, but they could mean very different things for different people, or even for the same person. So these trainers were under her work desk, and some days that represented work-family conflict to her. If she hadn't managed to go, that was like a reminder there for her that I've not managed to go because I'm working and I've not had a break to go and do some exercise or to go to the gym. Whereas on days where she had, this was a reminder, oh, I've got my work-life balance sorted because I managed to go to the gym. So this could symbolize either. So photographs can be a really useful way of diaries as well. And participants keeping the photo diaries suggest that this is quick, it's easy, and it's not as hard to get them to do it. So that can be quite useful as well. So hopefully we'll see that there's all these rich mediums that we want to be able to capture. And that's why we wanted to use an app. We've actually been thinking about this for ages. So I started work at Liverpool University in 2014, and I wanted to do it then. And I'd started to think about it then, and I met Leanne, who also wanted to do that for her PhD. And we started thinking about it then, and they were developed about last year. So that's the kind of length of time it took us. We're hoping that it wouldn't take you all the same length of time. So basically, it's that we've created a few diary apps. And the point is that we want to overcome some of those challenges that we mentioned before. So we wanted to be able to get all those we want them to be able to have the option to type, to speak into the app, to take photos in the app if they want to, and also that then we can get that data immediately. I'm moving on to, no, it's mine first, isn't it? Okay, so we've got 2 examples. We've got 2 apps at the moment, and we've got 2 examples. So this is the app that I was looking at developing, and at the same time we were developing Leanne's for her PhD research. So we're going to talk you through the examples in turn. And what this one was is the one where you heard the audio recording of the lady at first. So she audio recorded into the app, actually. So this is the transition to parenthood research. So I was interested in this period of time because it's a time when identity change is huge. So obviously, you know, people have got to take on a whole new identity as a parent. It's also usually the period of time where men and women go from being very equal in terms of work to being very unequal, even if they start off with good intentions. So I wanted to explore how that happened, and also was really interested in the shared parental leave that, I don't know if anyone know about shared parental leave, that came out in 2015 in the UK, meaning that it's a different option to maternity leave where partners can more equally share the time off with the children and the impact that can have. So I thought, right, I want to keep diaries because I love diaries, and also because I know that to capture this kind of as it's happening, I'm obviously going to interview them at certain points in time, but I'm going to miss so much in between. So I want to use diaries, but this isn't 4 weeks like it was previously that I was getting people to keep diaries. This is going to be like 18 months. This is going to be a long time. I'm never going to get them to keep a pen and paper diary for this long. They're going to lose it, they're just going to forget it, it's not going to happen. So I felt like an app was almost crucial to this kind of project. So this is how this one came about, and if this is the app, I hope this is going to work. So we have the introduction screens of the app, which is kind of like your information sheet, but it goes through, you know, what this app's about when they log into the app. And then they fill it in, and they also, this terms and conditions sends them to a participant information sheet. This is their consent form in there as well. Oh, we had an initial mood thing in case they were doing it quickly. They've got different questions for different stages in mind, depending whether they're pregnant, whether they're on maternity, paternity leave, whether they're back at work. So, and these were the kind of open-ended, like semi-structured questions that we were asking. And you can see that they can take a photo if they want, or they can audio record with the microphone up there, or they can type. So, or they can do all of it, or whatever they feel like that day, or, you know, whatever works for them. Or they can take a photo and then talk about it. So it provides all those options. And then I'm going to let Leanne talk about hers now.
Thank you. Okay, so like I said in the beginning, my research is looking at workplace mistreatment, specifically interpersonal mistreatment. So when I started my PhD, having looked at the literature, I saw a lot of the existing research is looking at the aftermath of this experience, right? So people who are mistreated at work tend to have bad psychological outcomes, and it tends to happen in stressful work environments. There was a very limited amount of research on, firstly, how this experience sort of emerges, and then how it's experienced on a day-to-day basis. So like I said, drawing from the practical advice that people are given when they're mistreated, and also the lack of research into the day-to-day experience, I thought, bingo, we can combine this and provide people with a nice tool and give me really good data as to what it's like on a day-to-day basis. So the aims of using the diary methodology were to explore how mistreated employees experience, respond to, and make sense of this on a day-to-day basis and over time. Explore variations of these processes across men and women, because again, imagine what it's like as a man being bullied by a woman or a woman by a man and that kind of thing. And again, there's very limited research looking at those specific gender dynamics. And then also, and this sort of came up in, I think it was like middle of last year, where I had some interest from trade unions who were looking to explore the feasibility of the app as a tool to enhance communication between the members and the trade union, and also as a tool for people who are potentially interested in filing a grievance so that they can actually go and have somewhat decent evidence. Because what happens is it's often quite late down the experience when people think, oh, I need to report this, and then they go to the trade union member and they're like, well, what evidence do you have? And it will be printouts of emails and notes on loads of different pieces of paper. So the trade union wants to see, okay, well, can this improve things? So my app, this is what my one looks like, if it would load. So you just open it on the screen, add an entry, swipe up or down to give an emotional rating when they first go onto it. Again, looking at the emotional impact of this day to day. Describe how they're feeling in that time, and then there's 4 questions. So the first one was how was work today, and it's kind of to get like a benchmark idea of how the day at work was. The second question, so as they move on, looks at did they experience any negative interactions or mistreatment at work? If so, what was the impact on this, work-related and person-related? And how do they feel about going to work tomorrow? And that's to look at sort of effects of anticipation of mistreatment experienced on one day. How does that go into the next? Okay, so some of the advantages of using app diaries that we found. So in terms of having a paper diary, for my research in particular, that is quite risky. So if someone is being bullied at work and they've got this paper on the diary and someone else at work finds it, that causes some issues. So with this, the password protection of the device gives an extra layer of sort of safety. Again, with it not being a piece of paper, it's just on their phone, it's hidden, no one knows that they're doing it. It just looks like they could be sending a text message or something. It's just a bit different to someone having to write out a diary. And a lot of my participants didn't even tell their partners that they were being mistreated, so there's a lot of secrecy involved with this, and the app kind of helps that privacy. Ease of use for participants, hopefully, that again, I think this is really related to who your sample is, so, and also how well your app turns out. And as I'll get on to, we had several iterations, and I had quite a lot of participants complain about mine in the initial phases, just because they didn't like the sort of transition from screen to screen and just minor bugs and that kind of thing. Immediate receipt of diary entries. Now this is excellent, because as soon as someone logs a diary, Laura and I get it immediately on a back end. So if you're working on a project, you can just go on to it every day, see who's uploaded. It also enhances that communication. So if someone stops filling in, you can then contact them and be like, why? But I guess there's a fine line between sort of surveilling people and keeping contact, but I'm sure no one's going to be too rigorous with it. Automatic access for all the researchers in the project. So if you're working on a collaborative project, so Laura and I can log on to the same back end and work on it when Laura's working from home or I'm working from home. Multi-modal options, so again, the ability to put photos, voice, text. And then media and organizational interest. And this has been really helpful for me in my PhD. Just gaining access to people, but also sort of building a researcher profile has been really useful for that. Because I think when you go to an organization, you're like, I want to keep a diary on your employees, they can be a bit sort of wary of doing it for obvious reasons. But when you go in with a snazzy app, they seem to think, oh, this is interesting, because there's a lot of, because it's a very innovative approach, a lot of organizations want to get on board with that. So it's really useful for getting access. Okay, but some of the challenges. Now, that link that we've put up there.
I've got some hard copies, but not anywhere near enough. So maybe if we just pass a few back, so we can just like pass them around. So we've tried to do a checklist or information sheet on to try and overcome all the problems that took us 3 years to solve.
Yes. Yes.
To help you not make all the mistakes that we've made.
Yeah. So we've been quite in depth with each of these things. So one of the questions that I think is quite useful is there an existing app? And the answer is yes. There are several options, which I've been quite in depth on that information sheet. So as I'm not sure if many of you are aware, but funding an app can be really, really expensive if you go to a private developer or outside your institution. So we have provided options on existing apps. Can you develop? I've provided options for training, options for using, I don't know how many of you are aware, but there are sort of development platforms where you can go and use sort of blocks of code and build simple apps. The NCRM also had 2 events this year on coding smartphone apps using simple coding blocks, which was really useful. Highly recommend that. And then
After we'd already
yes, that was unfortunate timing. And then also developing the app. So Laura has kindly gone through all finding the right person, how much it costs, pilot testing, We've gone through privacy, so that if you are interested in this, please have a look at that information sheet, because we have put a lot of time and a lot of examples that we would have really appreciated a couple of years ago. Okay, so let's talk about developing an app, the process of this. Right, so as you can see from this, it should zoom in a little bit more, I apologize for that, but there's a lot of steps along the way. It isn't simply you have an idea, you go to a developer, and then boom, we've got this app within a couple of weeks. It takes a very, very long time. So if you are in the first year or first couple of months of your PhD, start as soon as possible, because I was really delayed in getting this, and also ethical approval for something like this can take quite a bit more time. But basically, you want to start off with your ideas. So why is it that you want to use an app? What kind of questions are you going to be asking? So on this, you can see these broadly map onto my app questions, and you can see over there. So Laura and I were going back and forth discussing, because Laura is the expert on diary methodology, so we were getting feedback on the questions. And then from this, create a paper version, pilot the paper questions, even if it's on like a group of fellow researchers or your friends or your own personal networks, just to see if they make sense. Create a simple app markup for your developer before you go and see them, right? So, because one of the issues that we had is when you go and talk to a developer, they talk to you in really technical terms and don't quite understand what a qualitative diary is, okay? Yeah, and it was, I think that really made the process a lot more drawn out than it needed to be, because it was all, what rating, what numbers are you using? We were like, no. So having a basic idea of what your app is going to look like is really, really useful, just sort of getting over the hurdles of communication. Then, first thing you want to do before finding a developer, though, is go to your in-house legal department at the university. Moving forward, anyone who wants to do this kind of thing, go see a legal representative, get some advice, because they're going to help you with things like protecting your IP, drawing up a contract with the developer, protecting you, and of course the university. So discuss ideas with the developer, what's feasible. They'll then come up with sort of like a prototype for you. So they'll refine those app screens that you come up with. This is a long back and forth type process. But eventually you'll end up with a prototype or a pre-alpha version, which is a really simple version that goes straight onto your device through a link. It's not on the App Store yet, nowhere near. And then this process of version testing, fixing, version testing, fixing, and this goes on for quite an extended period of time until you get to the release candidate. And this is where things of funding that you had no idea about will come up. So for example, publishing onto Apple's iOS store or App Store, that's another cost. Android is a lot more friendlier with that. And also things like iOS and Android development are completely different. It's completely different languages. Developers hate it. But these kind of things we have gone through in the information sheet. I highly recommend looking at that. But eventually you'll get it onto the App Store, and then invariably Apple will update their software, and then you'll have some more issues. So your developer is going to have to maintain the app. But once you get it to a reasonable standard, you can start recruiting your participants, and then you'll have your data. And this is all covered in that information sheet. Okay, so how do we analyze qualitative diary data? Can I just check how people who have used diaries before, how did you analyze your data? If you don't mind me asking. Somebody speak to me. Sorry? Text analysis, so thematic approaches. Anyone else? Yep.
Yeah, thematic framework analysis.
Okay. Thematic framework analysis. Anyone use anything that wasn't theme-based? No, and that is the problem with diary data, right? So we've got this amazing data that is going over time and it gives us loads of variance, but then looking at existing research and even our own research at times, it tends to rely on thematic approaches. So we started thinking about, okay, well, how can you sort of move beyond thematic analysis? And it really depends on the data you've collected. So for example, if you have the visual data, like how Laura had those photos, an interesting approach is sort of grounded visual pattern analysis. So those two photos that both had shoes could invariably be put together as patterns or themes, so they would be themed together. Also sort of semiotic analysis, so looking at the content of the pictures. Audio data, so again, where Laura's participants have been voice recording, and if you were using audio diaries, I haven't seen people do sort of discourse or linguistic approaches to that, because I think what quite an interesting idea would be is so the phone, if it's on their phone, it's their device, right? But then the app, they're speaking to it with this sort of imagined audience of the researcher. And I think it would be quite interesting to look at sort of conversation-based approaches of how they're talking to something that is their device with this imagined audience. And that was just me sort of thinking. But again, most text-based approaches rely on thematic approaches and are often collected in tandem with other methods like interviews. So if you, for example, were doing narrative interviews, you could create sort of narratives with your diaries as well as complementary methods. Okay, so look, we're going to talk through some practical examples of analysis. So Laura is going to talk about her research, and then I'll be back shortly.
Okay, so as Leanne said, thematic analysis, well, I think thematic analysis is always important, especially as Leanne mentioned, you're doing diaries along with other things as well, but I don't think it's enough for diaries. You're getting a list of themes, that's not that helpful to, compare things over time. So this is for the research I did with couples, which you've seen a few examples of how they manage their work-family conflict on a day-to-day basis. So these were the kind of questions. And I think the method that you choose, obviously, is very much influenced by what you're trying to find out and also why you're using the diaries in the first place. So hopefully you're only using a qualitative diary if there's a good reason related to the questions that you're asking, right? So you're probably trying to harness one of the benefits. One of the benefits we listed on one of the early slides. One of those benefits is why you need that qualitative diary. So which benefit is it? Or is it a number of benefits? I think that leads you to what kind of analysis you need to do. So for this research, I was interested in the specific events themselves. So the benefit that I was mainly drawing on of diaries was the in-the-moment, non-retrospective detail of that event and how, what happens within that event. So it was that I was interested, rather than maybe change over time, which is another really important benefit of diaries. So my question isn't how it changes over time. My question is how it's happening in the moment. What are the intricate details in those events that are having an impact? So that means that I did start with a thematic analysis, which I think is important. I used template analysis by Nigel King. I don't know if any of you use that. That's a good one because it's very flexible. So I could use the same thing across my interviews and my diaries and any other information you've got. But then I use these activity or event diagrams, which I think are important in diary analysis, especially if your focus is on the events or the activities or those experiences day to day. So for every single event or experience that was recorded in the diaries, I made one of these diagrams. Okay, so it told me the things that I was interested in. So what kind of conflict were they experiencing, then what decision were they making, what factors were affecting that, and what was the outcome. So I made these diagrams and I linked it back to the thematic analysis with the codes so that I had a kind of, here are all the interesting themes coming out and here's how they fit together in the diagram. So it was like a stage 2. So I'd say this is stage 1, drawing the diagrams would be stage 2, and then comparative analysis. So it depends what you want to compare. So I wanted to do some within-person comparison. So that's the second one. So we can see you've got like 2 days there. So you could put all of those next to each other to compare them, to look across the diagrams to see what's going on here within person. So for example, one decision you make can affect the next decision you make. Because if your daughter's unhappy in this example by Sylvia because she's stayed late at work rather than getting to pick her up and she's been a bit late, the next day she wasn't likely to do that again. So it's kind of seeing how one event affects another, but it's not looking at a change over time so much as how one event affects another. So then you line the diagrams up and you can see, What you can also do is you can compare, obviously within the couples, I was looking at couples, so I was interested in comparing the same event from two perspectives. So there you've got, these are members of a couple. You saw that in the written kind of text that I compared earlier, of the woman saying all this and the man saying nothing. Here you can see a more kind of back and forth between a couple. So if couples are recording the same event, which often they would be, then you can put those two side by side and compare them within the couple. What I also did that's not on here is that I wanted to also compare more broadly. So I wanted to be able to compare kind of just generally how couples were making decisions. Was it different across couples? So what I did was then I made more of a composite diagram for each couple. So obviously when you do that, as when you create some themes in a template like this, you are losing some of the richness. So you have to have some way to bring that richness back in when you need it. But what I did was I created a kind of what they usually do within that couple. So if they faced a work-family conflict, a daily one, what did they usually do for each couple, and a diagram for that. So they usually, the first point of call was this, the second point of call was this, for each couple, so that I could compare across couples. So that's another level of comparative analysis. So that enabled me to find things like, if the man worked more flexibly, then he wouldn't be the last point of call. If he didn't, he would always be the last point of call in the decision. When a man had a more flexible job than a woman, then he would be much higher up in the list of how we resolve these decisions. So that was enabled by this different level of comparative analysis, by making a kind of a composite of all these diagrams for one couple. What's the general order? But you want to be able to zoom back out to the bigger picture as well. So sometimes you have to lose some of the richness for some comparisons, but it's good to maintain some of the richness so you can go kind of in and out, if that makes sense. So I think that for what I was looking at, these event-based diagrams are kind of the key that you have to do after the template analysis. But it depends what you're looking at. Now, these are two examples that aren't ours before we go on to Leanne's example. And these are other people who've done qualitative diary research in our field. And so the first study, which was Gillian Simon, she was looking at what activities constitute IT development work. So she looked at a team of 10 people working on the same project. So immediately you can see she's going to be able to look at the same events from 10 different perspectives. Okay, it all depends on how you're using the diary. But so she did these are activity diagrams as well. So they're similar to mine in a way, but rather than doing it for each event, she's kind of getting a general gist of activities. So in her thematic template, it would be like, these would be like the main order, the higher order themes, and they would have like sub-themes would be, but she wants to represent them in an activity diagrammatic way. Because the point of the diary isn't so we can have a list of themes. The point of a diary is so that we can see connections, so that we can see how events work on a day-to-day basis. So these are these kind of activity diagrams. Then this one, Balogun and Johnson. Julia Balogun's actually our dean of our management school, so shout out for her work. She was looking at it's similar to Simon's in that she's looking at events, but she wanted to see how change emerged over time. So we can see that she's got a time axis here, and what this is more of a composite. So when I was talking about the composites I created rather than individual events, this is more of a composite of, she was exploring kind of one process recorded by, I think it was 20-something different people's diaries of middle managers. And how they responded to change and how they were dealing with change. And so this is over time how they dealt with change. So because she's looking at change over time, you need to incorporate a time element. So obviously she also wrote narratives alongside this to keep the richness, because she's had to then reduce to give the comparative over time. Okay. Okay, and this is yours, but not yours.
So when we were looking at examples to include that had sort of interesting analytical approaches, It was quite limited, again, because people tend to rely on thematic-based approaches. But this is one of my fellow PhD students at the University of Liverpool. This is Rachel Spence, if you'd like to find her. She's on Twitter there. Really interesting research, and she's looking at how well-being emerges in the context of self-tracking, so things like Fitbits. And so what she did, she was lucky enough that her boyfriend is a coder, so he was able to create a very simple Android-based diary app, and because her sample were people who use fitness tracking, she had a really good response from these people because they're just that sort of quantified self. People really enjoy keeping diaries. So basically, she was looking at how sort of well-being is over time and what the sort of influence of these trackers was. So if someone, for example, started tracking to lose weight, how did those motivations change over time? And what were their sort of feelings towards self-tracking over time? Okay, so she had multi-modal data in her, so some people recorded their voice, some people added photos, and she also had the text-based diary. So in terms of analyzing it, what she was doing was looking at how the individual, so she did like a thematic-based approach, and then later in her analysis, she started using sort of relational mapping techniques, so visualizing how people move from one motivation to another over time. And it's using this sort of composite narrative approach, which you often see in sort of strategy-based research, where you'll have the voice of the participant interspersed with the voice of the researcher and sort of describing how their motivations and perceptions have changed over time. So that's one way to include it, is narrative-based approaches to including temporal aspects of research. But what I quite liked with Rachel is where she was able to get photos as part of her diary entry. So this participant in particular, he added this because he was saying that the numbers don't matter. And the numbers don't matter to him because he got to 25,939 and they don't matter to him, so he wasn't going to move to get it to 26,000. And you can see this really interesting data that Rachel's got and how people sort of relate to their wearables. So I really recommend checking her out on Twitter. Okay, so my research. Okay, so I'm really, really interested in the overtime aspect in my analysis. And this is something that Laura and I have been working on, of how to incorporate temporality in the data analysis. It's very difficult. Publications limit you to a very small space. But in the thesis, we're exploring this. So forgive me if I'm not going into too much detail, but it's because it's not fine-grained and I haven't quite worked it out yet. But so my data has 3 temporal orientations. I also use in-depth retrospective narratives, but I'm going to focus on the diary data here. So I have the in-the-moment reporting, the day-to-day, and then over the full time period, right? So it's this real process of zooming in. So in terms of looking at how the within-person changes over that time, and then also looking at the cross cases, so how do different individuals experience mistreatments on a day-to-day basis. So I followed Laura's sort of example and I created sort of experience trees, which I'll go into, but because my diary app also had the emotional rating, I was able to kind of see how they're experiencing work emotionally each day. And so peaks in the diagram are particularly negative days. So can you guess which day they had an interaction with their perpetrator? And this was because they were having a weekly meeting with their manager, who they perceived as being their bully, and you can see there's spikes in the diary. But I also think quite comforting as well, there's also scope for positive days in that. So in terms of analysing the text data over time, I'm working on a combination of sort of visual mapping and inclusion of that, but I don't know how that's going to work yet. And then I also created these sort of experience trees, so how each day, sort of like how Laura's, where the decisions were linked, and you could see the difference between that. So that's what I have come up with so far. But I am in the process of writing up my analysis, so in a couple of months I'll have a more sort of finite version of that. And then conclusions.
Okay, so nothing worth having was achieved without effort, is my key thing for diary, for diary research, for all qualitative diary research and also for apps. So obviously this is not an easy method, but I think it's really worthwhile persevering because you get a different kind of data that you just cannot get with interviews. I think interviews are great and you need them, but you get this completely different kind of data. So persevere would be what I suggest, but obviously it's got to fit your research. So you need to know if your research questions really warrant a diary in the first place, and then thinking about your research questions, the kind of data that you need, and also your participant, your sample, what kind of diaries, if diaries are relevant, what kind of diaries are going to work best. And as you've hopefully seen today, there's so many options. Qualitative diaries do not mean one thing, they mean so many things. So yeah, we are arguing that the potential rewards make perseverance worthwhile. Hopefully you can see that, but you feel free to ask questions about that. They really enable this more in-depth exploration of day-to-day events that you just can't capture with an interview. And also the app diaries offer so much potential in overcoming a lot of the challenges with normal diaries. Like we've said, getting that data immediately as a researcher as they do it is just fantastic. Because that was one of the hugest issues, is not seeing what they're doing until you get it back at the end. If you can see what they're doing, one, you can already go and say, oh, a bit more detail about this, or could you expand here? You can check up if they're okay, if they've not filled it in for a while. You can analyze as you go, so that if you're doing a longer study like I currently am, and you're going to interview them at different periods, you've got your analysis ready and ready to go in for the next interview. So I think that's fantastic. But obviously, as you've seen, not without its challenges, huge long process, the stress involved with us getting these, these app diaries. We're hoping that with the information sheet, I know we really whizzed through the kind of process because it's long and we could have spent all day telling you about the process of getting these apps off the ground. But this is why we've prepared those sheets that have passed around that Leanne's kindly put a link in the slide so you can all have a look. That's quite detailed. And it's really we're so trying to have for everybody else what we wish we had to kind of speed along the process. It won't make it really fast. You still obviously need to allow sufficient time to pilot test your app and things like that. But hopefully it's a guide that's a good starting point so that you don't go in blind, and also just so you even know what they're talking about when they talk about JavaScript or things that we were just like, what? So hopefully it's helpful. It's got its challenges. If you can get an app to work, I think it can be really, really useful. It gets a lot of media attention as well. You suddenly on the radio and all kinds of things just because of an app. We've been doing the same research for ages, but because there's an app, now it's all exciting. As always, it's the choice of method, including analytical processes, should be led by your research questions and the aims of your study. We've only touched upon analysis, and obviously it's really hard to say this is an analysis strategy for everybody because it'll be different depending on your research questions. But my suggestion would be think about why you need the diary. So think about what research questions are leading to what benefit of the diary method you are using the diary for, and that will tell you what analysis you need to do. So is it to get the event? Is it to get the depth of the event? Is it to get the change over time? Well, then you need an analysis that goes over time. So hopefully there's some good examples there that you can start to look at and see what would work for you if you're thinking of using diaries. Okay, I think that's everything.
Just if I was doing this again, what I would do is firstly check out using existing app development platforms, because I think you can really, unless you've got amazing amounts of funding from a big research council or something like that.
Funding is in the sheet.
Yes,
yeah.
Those app development platforms has really come on in the last couple of years, and I've put a lot of information there, and it also gives you the freedom to sort of play around in testing the app as well, because you're basically the owner of that. So I really recommend checking that out as a first protocol. Yeah. And that training, if we had had that
NCRM training that we had on how to create simple smartphone apps, which we only had like a couple of months ago, was really good. If we'd have had that at the beginning, we would have probably done that. So you can create your own smartphone apps. They'll only be simple though. It's about how much you want to build in there, whether you might need something different, but it would definitely be worth checking out. Hopefully they'll run that event again, and it kind of teaches you how to do it. You don't have to code. You don't have to learn to code, because obviously that would take quite a long time.
And it was really useful. So like I said, if we were if we had had that earlier, we probably would have gone
Yeah.
with the book, just because of the costs and not being in full control of things. And with that, if you were coding that yourself, changing a question would be a lot easier than sort of what we had, where you have to go through about 7 people to get something changed.
Yeah.
So,
Show us the link again to your
yes,
team?
of course.
A lot of us don't have one.
Yeah.
And like we have said, if you're going to start the process of getting someone to help you build an app, and I've put in a lot in the information sheet how about it could be kind of an MSc project or a PhD student, or there's lots of other ways to kind of minimize those costs, but get a contract from the beginning, and you will have a central, if you're in a university or any kind of institution like that, you will have a central team who deal with these things, who help you with these things. So you just need to find them and get them to draw up a contract, and also get them to make sure that you're covered with any data privacy, data protection issues, to make sure that you're all covered in that respect as well, which will help you with your applying for ethics and things like that too. Okay, any questions?